So we often think of financial success as purely intellectual, right? Like whoever has the best spreadsheet, they win.
Yeah, the smartest person in the room.
But what if that's completely backwards? What if it's more about our feelings, our past experiences, the stuff that seems irrational?
Uh-huh. That's actually what dictates whether we sink or swim financially.
Exactly. Morgan Housel put it in a way that really flipped my thinking. He said, a genius who loses control of their emotions can be a financial disaster.
Mm-hmm.
The opposite is also true. Ordinary folks with no financial education can be wealthy if they have a handful of behavioral skills that have nothing to do with formal measures of intelligence.
And what's so great about that, I think, is how it sort of levels the playing field, you know?
Yeah,
It suggests you don't need some fancy economics degree to build wealth. You need to understand yourself, understand the psychology involved.
precisely. And that's really the mission for this deep dive. We're
Mm.
not going to be talking about, the latest Fed move or trying to pick the next hot stock.
Yeah.
Instead, we want to explore how your unique personal history, the way you grew up, the specific economic times you've lived through, how that has shaped your relationship with money.
Often in ways you don't even realize.
Totally. We want to get to the heart of why someone might make a money decision that looks completely bonkers to us.
Mm-hmm.
But when you understand their background, their story, it suddenly makes sense.
And our guide for this is Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money. What I find so powerful about his work is how direct it is.
Yeah.
He doesn't get bogged down in complex theories. He just delivers these short, sharp insights that make you stop and go, huh, I never thought of it like that.
Absolutely, those little light bulb moments.
Right.
And the foundational idea we're starting with is this. When it comes to money, nobody is actually crazy.
Right.
Our perspectives, even the ones that seem wild to others, they're deeply rooted in the incredibly diverse experiences we've all had. Okay, so let's unpack this, starting with the power of personal history.
Yeah, this is where it gets really fascinating. Think about two different people. One maybe grew up in a household that was always struggling, maybe even faced real poverty,
Okay.
versus someone who grew up, an affluent, wealthy banker's kid, financial security was just a given. How do you think their basic approach to risk and reward might differ later on?
Well, it seems pretty clear, right? The first person might be way more risk-averse. They'd prioritize safety, stability, because they know what it feels like to not have it.
Exactly. They've felt the sting of insecurity.
Whereas the second person, they might have a much higher tolerance for risk, maybe see it as just part of growing wealth because they never really experienced a major financial blow.
Precisely. Or take someone who saw high inflation just chew through their family savings. That's not just some abstract economic concept for them.
No, it's real. It's emotional.
It's a visceral memory, maybe of their parents' stress, watching their money buy less and less. Now, contrast that with someone who's only known low, stable prices.
Right. For them, runaway inflation is just something in a history book. It doesn't have that same weight.
It's not about one being smarter or having better information. It's the emotional resonance of those lived experiences. It shapes their gut reactions.
Totally.
Think about a stockbroker who was actually working during the Great Depression. The scale of that collapse, the bankruptcies, the job losses, that would leave a permanent mark.
Oh, absolutely. Their view of risk would be fundamentally different.
Yeah, compared to, say, a tech worker who started during the dot-com boom in the late 90s. For them, it was all rapid growth, seemingly endless upside, very different feeling.
And it's not just individual stuff, right? It's the broader economic climate we grow up in.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned someone in Australia. What was it, 30 years without a recession?
Yeah, imagine that, a whole generation, essentially, without experiencing a major downturn.
That's a profoundly different backdrop compared to someone in the U.S. who's seen several recessions.
Yeah.
Your assumptions about job security, economic stability, they'd just be different.
And what's really key here, as Housel points out, is that we all might see the same news, the same data.
Right.
We filter it through our own past, your personal experiences, even though they're just a tiny fraction of all financial history.
They feel like 100% of it to you.
Exactly. They make up almost your entire worldview when it comes to money. It is your reality.
It's like we each have this internal database built from our own lives.
Yeah.
And that's what shapes how we react to new information. Housel used that example of JFK.
Oh, yeah, the point about the Great Depression.
Right. His privileged background meant he just didn't have that direct experience. And apparently that became a thing in the 1960 election. Could he really get the economic fears of ordinary Americans.
And that really highlights how hard it is to truly grasp an experience you haven't lived. You can read about it, study it.
You can't feel it the same way.
No, investor Michael Batnick put it perfectly. Some lessons have to be experienced before they can be understood. It's that deep, felt understanding that often drives our choices.
So this idea that our financial outlook is shaped by when we grew up, that's something economists have actually studied, right? Malmendier and Nagel.
Yes, exactly. Ulrich Malmendier and Stefan Nagel did some really groundbreaking work on this.
What did they find?
Well, they looked at this huge data set, 50 years of the Survey of Consumer Finances, and they found a really clear connection. People's investment decisions over their lifetimes were heavily influenced by the financial conditions they experienced, especially in their early adulthood.
So the economy we encounter when we're young adults kind of sets the tone for later life.
It really does. For instance, people who grew up when inflation was high, they tended to invest less in bonds later on.
Makes sense.
Yeah, compared to people who experienced low inflation during those key years. If your early lesson was inflation eats fixed income, you're probably going to be wary of bonds for a long time. Those early lessons are sticky.
Okay, so that's bonds. What about stocks? Same pattern.
Yep, similar thing. People who came of age during a really strong stock market boom, they were significantly more likely to put more money into stocks later in life.
So their first taste of the market was positive, basically. Growth, opportunity.
Exactly. It likely gave them more confidence, more willingness to take on that equity risk.
It's almost like our financial DNA gets stamped in during those early years.
That's a great way to put it. As Malmendier and Nagel themselves put it, our findings suggest that individual investors' willingness to bear risk depends on personal history. It's not just about numbers or advice, it's about our personal journey through different economic times.
That clicks when you think about famous investors. Like Bill Gross, the bond king. His huge success happened during a long period of falling interest rates, right?
Which is great for bonds.
Absolutely. His timing, or rather the environment he operated in, was crucial. Now think about his father's generation. Many of them lived through high inflation.
They would have seen bonds very differently, maybe as dangerous even. Potentially, yeah. Seeing them as something whose real value could just get wiped out by inflation. Gross's success was shaped by his specific era. Someone else, with different formative experiences, might have been much more cautious about bonds.
You could even imagine more extreme examples.
For sure. Think about someone growing up in post-WWII Germany or Japan. Economies totally shattered. Compare that to someone in the U.S., which came out of the war much stronger economically.
Their fundamental beliefs about financial stability, about whether markets can even survive, worlds apart.
Completely. And this helps explain why you and I can look at the same investment, the same news, and have totally different reactions.
Yeah, what seems like a sure thing to one person looks terrifyingly risky to another.
And it all comes back to those deeply embedded beliefs shaped by our past. It dictates how we interpret information, who we trust, what strategies feel right, often regardless of what the latest expert says.
Okay, so if our history shapes us so much, then even decisions that look, well, completely nuts from the outside, they might make a certain kind of sense from the inside, from that person's perspective. Let's talk about lottery tickets.
Yeah, this is a fascinating example because, the amount Americans spend on lottery tickets is huge.
More than movies, music, books, all combined.
Something like that, yeah. And if you look at who buys them most often, it tends to be people in lower income households.
Which seems totally backwards, especially when you hear that many of those same people might struggle to cover like a $400 emergency.
Exactly. From a purely rational financial planning perspective, it makes zero sense. But if you try to step into the worldview of someone with very limited economic mobility, very few pathways to significantly change their life.
Okay.
The lottery might represent something more than just terrible odds. It might feel like the only conceivable shot, however tiny, at a dramatically different life. A way out.
So it's less about the math and more about the dream, the possibility, even if it's almost zero.
It could be. Again, we're not saying it's a good financial decision. It's objectively not. But trying to understand the why, that gives you context. Housel says it well. What you're doing seems crazy, but I kind of understand why you're doing it.
Right. It pushes past just judging the action to trying to understand the motivation.
And it reminds us that financial decisions aren't made in a vacuum. They're tangled up with hope, sometimes desperation, ego, pride, marketing. It's all part of a personal story shaped by life.
It's a really powerful point. There's always a story behind the numbers.
Always. And this idea that our current way of thinking about money is maybe newer than we realize, that applies even to something as basic as retirement.
We just assume saving for retirement has always been a thing.
But it really hasn't, not in the way we think of it now. Before World War II, most Americans basically worked until they died or couldn't work anymore.
Wow.
The whole idea of a long, financially independent period after your career, that wasn't the standard expectation. Even early Social Security was more of a basic safety net.
So when did the idea of a comfortable, planned retirement become more widespread?
It really gained traction in the second half of the 20th century. Maybe particularly around the 1980s, the idea of a dignified retirement became more of a common goal.
And the tools we use now, the 401ks and IRAs, they're even more recent.
Incredibly recent. The 401k only came about in 1978.
78.
Yeah. And the Roth IRA, that wasn't until 1998. That's practically yesterday in the grand scheme of things.
That really changes how you look at it. So when people struggle with saving for retirement, maybe it's not just individual failure.
Exactly. Maybe it's partly because we're all still figuring out these relatively new systems and expectations.
We're adapting.
Yeah. As Hassel puts it, we're not crazy. We're all just newbies. We're all kind of first-generation users of this modern retirement savings landscape. Our difficulties aren't necessarily because we're lazy or bad with money. It's just new territory for society as a whole.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. What's the big takeaway here, the crucial insight from digging into this psychology of money?
I think the core idea is just how profoundly our individual journeys, the economic times we've lived through, the lessons we absorbed, maybe even unconsciously shape how we see and interact with money.
Right.
And because of that, a decision that looks totally irrational to one person might actually make perfect sense within the mental model of the person making it, given their unique experiences.
And realizing that, recognizing these different perspectives, that can be really useful.
Hugely useful. It can lead to, well, maybe a bit more empathy, a bit less judgment of how other people handle their finances.
Instead of just saying, that's dumb, you ask, I wonder what experiences led them there.
Exactly. And maybe even more crucially, it helps us turn the lens on ourselves, to become more aware of our own biases, our own ingrained beliefs that are steering our decisions without us even realizing it.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Think about your own earliest money memories. What was the economic vibe like when you were growing up, becoming an adult?
Yeah.
How might those early experiences be subtly shaping how you feel and act about money today? And could understanding those roots help you make maybe more conscious, more effective decisions going forward?
And maybe understand others a bit better, too.
Definitely. It really underscores that finance isn't just about charts and numbers. It's deeply, deeply human.